Camilla still wears the crown, her schedule appears unchanged, and her name retains its traditional place in the court circular. Yet, the actual, operational power inherent in the title of the king's consort, control over strategic patronage, and the ultimate veto over royal symbolism has been abruptly and permanently stripped from her. This authority was neither transferred to an external committee nor consigned to the state's historical archives. Instead, it was handed directly to her daughter-in-law, Catherine, Princess of Wales. The immediate reaction from Camilla behind closed doors was not a public outburst or a leaked grievance to the tabloid press, but a calculated, deeply furious institutional resistance. Sensing that the ground beneath her feet was rapidly liquefying, she immediately drafted a highly confidential, legally binding ultimatum and sent it directly to the king's private desk, demanding an immediate intervention to halt the quiet reallocations of her authority. What happened next shocked the veteran staffers within the palace infrastructure. The king's administrative team did not schedule an emergency meeting. They did not offer a diplomatic compromise, and they did not seek to pacify her anger. They rejected her demand entirely without a single formal discussion, treating the high-stakes ultimatum as if it were a routine piece of administrative junk mail, not even worthy of an executive session. This was not a domestic argument between a husband and a wife over royal logistics, nor was it a temporary dispute over who gets to represent the family at international galas. This was a cold, calculated, and irreversible institutional execution. The palace had made a sovereign choice, effectively indicating that while Camilla could retain the glittering diamonds and the public courtesies of a queen, her operational relevance to the future of the British monarchy had just been reduced to absolute zero. For those who closely monitor the internal machinations of the House of Windsor, this sudden, ruthless downgrading of the king's wife raises an immediate, chilling question that the mainstream media has spent months trying to avoid. Why did this catastrophic shift happen now, at the precise moment when the royal family is facing its most severe existential and health crises of the modern era? The answer to this mystery cannot be found in recent tabloid gossip or short-term PR strategies. To truly understand why the palace collapsed Camilla's authority with such clinical precision, one must look back at a hidden, decades-old constitutional compromise that the royal household desperately prayed the public would forget. It is a story rooted in an explosive, buried document from the year 2005, a legal covenant that laid out a definitive, terrifying condition that has finally caught up with the woman who spent 30 years fighting to sit on the throne. It was a promise that explicitly dictated Camilla was never supposed to be called queen. If you are fascinated by the hidden truths, the constitutional warfare, and the unspoken power plays that shape the highest echelons of global power, hit that subscribe button right now for Kingdom of Mist, because on this channel, we break through the polished palace public relations and speak the brutal, unvarnished truths that no one else in the media dares to utter. To understand the sheer magnitude of the trap that has just sprung shut around Camilla, you must re-examine the precise legal architecture of the 9th of April 2005. When Charles and Camilla finally stood together to legalize their relationship, the public hostility across the United Kingdom was so volatile, and the memory of Princess Diana was so intensely vivid, that the monarchy faced a genuine Republican threat. In a state of sheer panic, Clarence House issued a definitive, written constitutional pledge to the British Parliament and the public. The official declaration stated that when Charles eventually ascended the throne, Camilla would not assume the title of Queen Consort. Instead, she would officially be known as Princess Consort. This was not a casual suggestion or a flexible press release. It was a binding social contract designed to appease a furious nation, a legal trade-off that allowed the marriage to proceed only under the condition that Camilla would never occupy the sacred symbolic space left vacant by Diana. Yet, as the years rolled by, the palace engaged in what can only be described as the ultimate bait-and-switch operation. In early 2022, during the twilight months of her historic reign, Queen Elizabeth II was persuaded to issue a Jubilee statement expressing her sincere wish that when the time came, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. When the late Queen passed away later that year, Charles immediately discarded the 2005 covenant, throwing the promise of Princess Consort into the institutional wastebasket like an embarrassing, expired receipt. The palace machinery acted as if this had always been the grand design, attempting to gaslight the global public into believing that the 2005 pledge was merely a temporary misunderstanding. But the public did not forget. The sudden elevation of Camilla to queen was viewed by millions not as a triumph of love, but as a calculated institutional deception that violated the foundational trust between the monarchy and the people. What Charles and Camilla failed to realize, however, was that you cannot simply rewrite centuries of constitutional expectation without triggering a severe institutional immune response. In the constitutional framework of the United Kingdom, the title of queen is not merely a courtesy title given to the monarch's spouse. It is a sacred, symbolic office that requires the moral consensus and emotional consent of the governed. By forcing the title of queen onto a woman who had spent decades framed as the primary antagonist in the national tragedy of Diana, the palace created a massive, unstable friction within the British identity. Every time Camilla stepped out wearing the royal regalia, the public did not see a unifying symbol of the state. They saw a glaring emblem of institutional arrogance. The palace had successfully manipulated the legal definitions, but they had completely failed to secure the emotional allegiance of the public, leaving Camilla's title standing on a foundation of ice that was destined to crack the moment the wind changed. The first major twist in this constitutional drama arrived when the palace realized that history possesses a brutal, recurring habit of punishing royal overreach. Throughout the centuries, the British Parliament and the royal household have established a strict, unyielding precedent for royal spouses whose public standing threatens the stability of the throne. One only has to look back at the year 1857 to find the exact historical parallel that exposes the illegitimacy of Camilla's current title. When Queen Victoria sought to elevate her husband, Prince Albert, to the status of king consort, the British political establishment fiercely revolted. Despite Albert being a man of immense intellectual capability, a profound modernizer of the British state, and a devoted father to the heirs of the empire, Parliament completely denied him the title of king. The political elite and the public argued that a foreign-born prince with low national popularity could never hold the sacred title of king, forcing him to settle for the lesser title of prince consort until the day he died. This historical parallel strikes at the very heart of the modern crisis. If a transformative, universally productive figure like Prince Albert was forced to bow to the will of the state and accept a restricted title to protect the integrity of the crown, on what logical, historical, or moral ground does Camilla stand to claim the absolute title of queen? The answer is simple. She has none. The palace's decision to bypass historical precedent and enforce her status as queen was an act of administrative desperation that created a dangerous imbalance within the royal visual hierarchy. By holding the title of queen while completely lacking the historic popularity and moral authority required of the office, Camilla effectively became an institutional liability. As the calendar turned to the mid-2020s, a massive, unyielding visual conflict began to materialize within the House of Windsor. The palace found itself stuck in a disastrous paradox, where the woman holding the highest female title in the land was consistently ignored or resented by the public, while her daughter-in-law, Catherine, possessed the absolute adoration and moral authority of a future queen, despite holding a lower rank. This profound disconnect between official titles and actual public perception created a volatile atmosphere inside the institution. The stage was set for a quiet, clinical correction, a systemic operation by the deep state of the palace to realign the realities of power. Catherine was about to weaponize her immense public capital to launch a silent, devastating takeover, turning the 2005 covenant from a forgotten piece of paper into a clinical weapon that would dismantle Camilla's authority once and for all, leaving the world to wonder. What exactly was contained in those newly seized files that made the downgrading of the queen consort an absolute necessity for the survival of the crown? The second phase of this constitutional demolition began not with an open declaration of war, but with the enforcement of a chillingly quiet administrative protocol. To the cameras of the International Press Corps, the relationship between Queen Camilla and the Princess of Wales had always been choreographed as a flawless masterclass in multi-generational solidarity. The public was routinely fed an endless loop of carefully timed photographs showing the two highest-ranking women of the house sharing warm smiles on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, adjusting each other's royal regalia at formal state banquets, and presenting a unified front against external media storms. The global audience looked at these images and believed they were witnessing the consolidation of a powerful matriarchal alliance designed to stabilize the crown. But behind the heavy oak doors of the royal apartments, far beyond the reach of long-range paparazzi lenses, this beautifully crafted public illusion dissolved into the stark reality of a cold, transactional corporate contract. They did not share casual weekend visits. They did not engage in informal family group chats, and they did not exchange personal confidences regarding the volatile dynamics of palace staff. They functioned entirely as two highly disciplined diplomats representing competing factions within a fractured empire, forced by the realities of their jobs to maintain a strict, superficial non-aggression pact. Camilla represented the old guard, a defensive, survivalist era of the monarchy defined by behind-the-scenes media trading, non-disclosure agreements, and a desperate, decades-long campaign to force a deeply reluctant public to accept her presence. Catherine, by contrast, represented an entirely different currency. An organic, effortless, and unassailable public adoration that required no artificial PR life support. The friction between these two fundamentally incompatible worlds began to spark dangerous internal fires when Camilla's private office made a terrifying discovery. They realized that the entire apparatus of long-term strategic decision-making, the ultimate veto over the royal family's multi-million-dollar branding assets, and the most critical weekly briefings with the king's senior constitutional advisors were completely bypassing her desk and heading directly to the Princess of Wales. While the global media was deliberately kept distracted by the explosive, sensationalized tabloid headlines surrounding the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's endless Netflix docuseries and self-serving promotional book tours, Catherine was quietly executing a masterclass in long-term institutional warfare. She completely understood that in the modern era, a royal cannot survive merely by acting as a passive ornament, cutting ribbons at local community centers, or standing as a mute prop for official photographs. Her signature initiative on early childhood development was meticulously engineered not as a superficial royal hobby, but as a sophisticated institutional power base. Instead of associating her name with a generic charity for a yearly photo opportunity, Catherine personally convened high-level summits inside palace walls, inviting world-renowned neuroscientists, top-tier Oxford academics, and senior government policymakers to debate actual socio-economic data and structural policy reform. She began speaking the clinical language of national infrastructure and long-term societal impact, effectively stepping into a domain of legislative and scientific influence that no senior member of the royal family had dared to occupy in decades. Every single public appearance by the Princess of Wales was no longer just a display of high fashion. It carried the immense, undeniable weight of a future head of state in waiting. This rapid, calculated intellectual evolution began to cast a devastating, long shadow over the current queen consort. While Camilla's office continued to schedule traditional, low-impact engagements like cutting ribbons at regional book fairs or attending polite, predictable garden parties, Catherine was effectively building a modern, shadow administration right under the king's nose. The contrast between the two operations became impossible for the palace hierarchy to ignore. One office was expending massive amounts of institutional energy just to maintain a baseline of public tolerance for an unpopular queen, while the other office was effortlessly generating massive amounts of genuine, high-value public trust that the monarchy desperately needed to secure its future. The profound twist embedded within this quiet shift of authority lies in the absolute, uncompromising nature of British sovereign power. Throughout the turbulent history of the House of Windsor, the true authority of the monarchy has never actually resided within the physical diamonds of the imperial state crown or the ancient wording of constitutional statutes. It has always depended entirely on an unwritten, highly volatile principle: the emotional consent of the governed. By elevates her public initiatives to the level of genuine national policy and scientific credibility, Catherine did something extraordinary. She effectively established an independent, bulletproof center of gravity within the institution that operated completely outside of Camilla's control. King Charles III, a monarch deeply obsessed with daily media metrics, public opinion tracking, and the historical legacy of his own reign, was forced to confront a brutal, unvarnished corporate reality. He realized that his daughter-in-law had successfully monopolized the only modern currency that could keep the House of Windsor relevant in a rapidly modernizing world, while his own wife was increasingly viewed as a highly expensive, symbolically stagnant liability. This structural realization immediately triggered a massive escalation of tension within the palace deep state. The institutional engineers who managed the survival of the crown came to a clinical, cold-blooded consensus. If the monarchy was to survive the turbulent years ahead, the visual and operational center of gravity had to be violently and permanently shifted away from the present and thrust entirely into the future. Catherine had successfully transformed the definition of a royal princess from a secondary, supportive role into a position of absolute strategic dominance. She had single-handedly exposed the fact that while Camilla held the official paperwork and the grand title of queen, she possessed none of the actual moral authority required to steer the ship of state through a modern storm. The palace was now trapped in a dangerous, high-stakes waiting game. Catherine had masterfully laid the groundwork for a complete systemic takeover, leaving the senior courtiers to face a terrifying new dilemma that would test the very limits of royal survival. When the inevitable day arrives that the institution is struck by a catastrophic, life-threatening crisis, which woman will the British public look to as the true anchor of the state? And what will happen to the desperate queen who realizes her throne has been completely hollowed out from within? The third phase of this constitutional warfare erupted into the public domain not through a calculated leak or a political scandal, but through a sudden, devastating human catastrophe that instantly shattered the fragile equilibrium of the royal household. In early 2024, the palace issued a highly unusual, abruptly worded announcement stating that the Princess of Wales had been admitted to a London clinic for a major, planned abdominal surgery, forcing the immediate cancellation of her entire public calendar for the foreseeable future. The initial strategy developed by the palace communications team was to maintain a strict, absolute wall of silence to prevent public alarm. However, the vacuum created by her sudden disappearance immediately triggered an unprecedented global media firestorm. Wild conspiracies, intense international speculation, and frantic public demands for information flooded the digital landscape, proving that the global audience refused to look away. The tension reached an absolute breaking point in March 2024, when Catherine bypassed the traditional, heavily controlled palace press channels and released a deeply personal, direct video message to the world. Sitting entirely alone on a simple wooden garden bench, she calmly and transparently revealed that post-operative tests had uncovered the presence of cancer, and she was now in the early stages of preventative chemotherapy. The global reaction to her diagnosis did not merely generate standard expressions of public sympathy. It unleashed a massive, historic wave of emotional shockwaves that completely overwhelmed the palace infrastructure. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, senior courtiers watched in utter disbelief as the British public responded with a level of organic, unscripted grief and fierce protectiveness that directly mirrored the national trauma surrounding the sudden death of Princess Diana in August 1997. Thousands of ordinary citizens, completely unprompted by any official palace press campaigns, began lining the gates of Kensington Palace, weeping openly and leaving massive mountains of floral tributes. This explosive public reaction exposed a profound, terrifying institutional reality that shook King Charles III to his core. The public's response was not a manufactured PR success. It was a raw, visceral declaration of absolute emotional allegiance. The world was making it undeniably clear that Catherine was no longer just a high-ranking member of the royal firm. She had become the absolute emotional anchor of the entire British identity. This catastrophic shift in public perception immediately triggered an aggressive, clinical realignment of power behind closed doors. By the spring of 2025, the internal power dynamic had altered so radically that the prestigious editorial offices of The Times and The Guardian began receiving high-level, verified briefings regarding a sweeping, historic restructuring of the royal household. King Charles III, operating under the heavy weight of his own ongoing battle with cancer, made a ruthless, calculated sovereign decision to secure the survival of the crown. He officially ordered the immediate, permanent transfer of a massive portfolio of core royal patronages away from the jurisdiction of Queen Camilla, and placed them directly onto the desk of the Princess of Wales. These were not minor, secondary charities. These were the crown jewels of royal influence, prestigious national institutions governing the arts, high literature, and major medical research networks that Camilla had spent the last 20 years meticulously cultivating to legitimize her public image. The profound twist embedded within this sudden reallocation of assets lies in a ruthless, unwritten rule of royal governance. In the House of Windsor, your patronages are your institutional oxygen. They represent your direct lines of communication with the political elite. your control over high society funding networks, and your structural relevance to the state. By systematically stripping these historic titles from Camilla and handing them to a recovering Catherine, the king was not merely lightening his wife's workload, he was executing a permanent, clinical corporate downsizing of her entire office. Camilla's private staff suddenly found themselves completely marginalized, watching helplessly as the senior constitutional advisors, who used to queue outside the Queen's office, shifted their absolute focus toward the Princess of Wales. The palace had effectively engineered a silent, irreversible coup, leaving the reigning queen holding a completely hollowed-out title, while setting the stage for an explosive confrontation that would force Camilla to launch one final, desperate counter-strike to save her disappearing legacy from being permanently erased by the rising tide of the future. The fourth phase of this internal palace revolution escalated from a silent administrative freeze into an explosive, high-stakes constitutional showdown behind closed doors. According to highly sensitive disclosures from seasoned royal biographers and veteran palace insiders, Queen Camilla quickly realized that her decades-long struggle to legitimize her position was being systematically undone in a matter of months. She was well aware that without the direct, active protection of King Charles III, her survival within the rigid machinery of the House of Windsor was in immediate jeopardy once the crown inevitably passed to Prince William. Trapped in a corner and facing absolute institutional erasure, Camilla made the most aggressive and high-risk countermove of her royal life. She circumvented the standard bureaucratic channels and delivered a dramatic, legally binding ultimatum directly to the king and his senior Privy Council advisors. Her demand was not centered around wealth, estates, or material privileges. Instead, Camilla demanded an absolute, written constitutional guarantee, a legally binding pledge signed by the sovereign himself, ensuring that her rank, her extensive media profile, and her official title of queen would remain completely untouched and legally protected during any future transition of power. This desperate ultimatum was a stunning admission of political vulnerability. The reigning queen of the United Kingdom was openly acknowledging that her official crown was completely devoid of actual structural security. The friction this move created within the palace walls was absolute. The modern British monarchy operates on a singular, unyielding Darwinian principle. The institution must always maintain complete flexibility to alter its internal layout in order to survive. Signing a written guarantee to permanently lock in the high status of an historically unpopular figure would completely bind the hands of the future king, preventing the monarchy from adapting to the changing desires of the public. The institutional response to Camilla's high-stakes ultimatum was a display of clinical, cold-blooded finality that shocked the remaining loyalists in her camp. The king's chief constitutional advisors did not initiate an emergency round of family negotiations. They did not offer a diluted legal compromise. And they did not even open the document for formal executive debate. They rejected her ultimatum outright, treating her desperate legal demand as a total non-starter. The palace inner circle argued that providing such a written guarantee was entirely incompatible with the long-term strategic interests of the British crown. Camilla, the woman who had endured 30 years of intense national hostility, media character assassination, and social exile just to finally stand at the altar of Westminster Abbey, was forced to swallow a brutal, unvarnished truth. The very same institution that had willingly bent its own rules to elevate her to the throne in 2022 was now completely prepared to cast her aside to protect the rising star of the monarchy. The profound historical twist driving this sudden rejection lies in the magnificent, poetic irony of royal destiny. The individual who is ultimately deciding Camilla's fate today is not King Charles III, and it is not the Princess of Wales. It is the lingering, unyielding ghost of Princess Diana. For nearly 3 decades, the palace public relations machine had exhausted hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to scrub Diana's shadow from the walls of Buckingham Palace and force the world to accept Camilla as the legitimate matriarch. Yet, when faced with an existential crisis of survival, the institution was forced to admit a devastating truth. They could not fight the memory of the people. Charles was forced to make a ruthless, clinical choice to invest the entire future of the monarchy into Catherine, because she is the only figure who possesses the authentic emotional connection to the public that Diana once held. To save the crown for the next generation, the king had to sacrifice the institutional standing of his own wife, leaving Camilla trapped in a state of absolute isolation, holding an empty title, while the palace deep state quietly prepares the final visual realignment that will permanently return her to the shadows. As the calendar advanced into 2026, the structural consequences of the palace's clinical downsizing of Camilla became glaringly obvious during major state events. A profound institutional paradox began to unravel on the global stage. The woman holding the highest female office in the land was increasingly treated by her own courtiers as a ceremonial afterthought, while the Princess of Wales, despite holding a technically lower rank, completely monopolized the optical center of gravity. This was not a subtle shift noticed only by seasoned royal commentators. It had become an unavoidable reality for millions of viewers watching the live broadcasts of state processions. Every time Camilla attempted to assert her presence as queen, the visual choreography arranged by the palace's deep state subtly but deliberately pushed her into the margins, ensuring that the television cameras consistently framed Catherine as the true, undisputed matriarch of the nation's future. This severe disconnect between official titles and actual public perception created a massive, unsustainable friction within the very fabric of the British Constitution. The senior administrative engineers of the Crown were forced to confront a terrifying new question that threatened to destabilize the upcoming succession. If the title of Queen is meant to be a sacred symbol of national unity, what happens to the integrity of the throne when the public openly views that title as an artificial, corporate deception? The palace had successfully manipulated the legal definitions in 2022 to please an ascending king, but by 2026, that short-term victory had transformed into a massive strategic liability. The institution found itself trapped in a dangerous visual bottleneck. They could not afford to let an historically resented figure dominate the royal brand while the monarchy was fighting for its survival in a rapidly modernizing world, yet they could not easily strip the title without openly admitting that the entire coronation of 2023 was a massive mistake. The hidden twist that broke this deadlock was a masterclass in bureaucratic stealth engineered by the king's senior constitutional advisors. Instead of launching a highly volatile public debate to strip Camilla of her title, the palace deep state weaponized a classic, time-tested weapon of the British establishment, the art of administrative strangulation. They quietly initiated a comprehensive policy known internally as the Stabilization Protocol, which effectively froze the budget, the staffing assets, and the public profile of the Queen's office. While Camilla was permitted to keep her official letterhead and her collection of historic tiaras, her administrative power to influence royal appointments, schedule independent overseas tours, or release unsanctioned media statements was completely revoked. Every single public move she made now required the direct, prior approval of the Prince and Princess of Wales's communications team, effectively placing the reigning queen under a strict institutional conservatorship managed by her own daughter-in-law. This unprecedented move immediately triggered a fresh wave of panic and silent fury within Camilla's shrinking circle of loyalists. They realized that the palace was not waiting for a future reign to diminish her legacy. The transition was happening actively in the present. Every major national broadcast, every strategic press briefing, and every high-level diplomatic reception was being meticulously engineered to prepare the global public for a Vung trio without Camilla's influence. The reigning queen was forced to sit in her private apartments and watch as the palace machinery slowly but surely erased her footprint from the modern history of the house, leaving the world to watch the final, inevitable phase of this high-stakes game of chess, where the ultimate resolution of her title would finally be delivered to a waiting nation. The glittering, diamond-encrusted crown that Camilla fought a 30-year social war to obtain has finally been exposed for what it truly is: a hollow, temporary concession from an institution that is now actively preparing to erase her name from the future. The intense institutional warfare, the silent administrative coups, and the systematic stripping of her power have culminated in a devastatingly clear reality. In the grand, millennium-old history of the British monarchy, the organization always wins, and the individual is merely a temporary tenant of a permanent office. The palace deep state has already finalized the ultimate post-Charles transition plan, a clinical, legal blueprint designed to correct the constitutional anomaly of 2022. When the current reign inevitably concludes and Prince William ascends the throne, Camilla will not be granted the traditional, highly influential status of Queen Dowager. The institution has quietly decided to hold her to the exact legal covenant established in 2005. She will be quietly retired into the historical archives, stripped of her operational titles, and officially designated as Princess Dowager, a title designed to minimize her public profile and return her permanently to the sidelines of the state. It is a stunning, historic demotion that will be framed by the palace communications team as a routine, respectful administrative update. But the world will know it as the final, clinical correction of a decades-long deception. This cold-blooded resolution represents the ultimate triumph of the emotional consensus of the people. While Camilla spent her life attempting to master the internal politics of the palace, Catherine focused on a far more powerful territory, the hearts of the global public. By aligning her life, her work, and her emotional vulnerability with the authentic spirit of Princess Diana, the Princess of Wales did not need to demand written constitutional guarantees or bargain for legal titles. Her authority was given to her freely by the millions of citizens who looked to her as the true, undisputed anchor of the modern crown. The visual and systemic takeover is complete. Catherine stands as the actual, undisputed matriarch of the nation's future, while Camilla is left holding a silent, empty Vungmirn that is rapidly fading into the shadows of history. As the heavy iron gates of Buckingham Palace close on this chapter of the Windsor saga, the lesson of this constitutional warfare remains written in stone. You can manipulate the paperwork, you can rewrite the press releases, and you can place a crown on an unpopular head, but you can never buy the soul of a nation. The ultimate authority of the monarchy will always belong to the one who commands the love of the people. Camilla's reign is effectively over. Not because of an open scandal, but because of the silent, unstoppable rise of the Queen who was always meant to be. Thank you for watching this deep dive investigation into the hidden machinery of the British Crown. If you want to stay ahead of the curve, uncover the unspoken truths, and understand the real power plays that the mainstream media is too afraid to touch, make sure to subscribe to Kingdom of Mist right now. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Catherine's silent takeover, and we will see you in the next broadcast.